I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today we are looking at a passage from Zhuangzi, or if I was being more technical and academic-y, I would say the Zhuangzi.
You're right, that sounds more pretentious, so we should probably stick with that.
The reason, of course, I'll probably go back and forth between Zhuangzi and the Zhuangzi, but we really don't know if Zhuangzi existed as a person. There may have been a guy, his last name may have been Zhuang, his first name may have been Zhou, and he may have been called Master Zhuang or Zhuangzi at some point. We don't really know that, but what we do know is that if he did exist, there are some parts of the text that we have, the book that we have called the Zhuangzi, which may have come from his hand, but some that definitely probably didn't come from his hand. The Nabian is the inside chapters, the inner chapters. The Weibian is the outer chapters, and then there's the Zabian, the random chapters or whatever. And the passage that we're looking at today is from the Weibian, the outer chapters. We know that it's not from. If there was a guy named Zhuangzhou, we know it's not written by him.
And I have to say, it matters very little to me, honestly, whether the guy existed or not. This for me and you, Lee, is sort of like going back to the well. There are certain writers, thinkers that I just can't get enough of, and you either. Zhuangzi is one of them. Pu Songling is another.
Zhuangzi kind of inspired me to get into Chinese literature. I mean, this was in Russell Kirkland's class in 2003, 2002, University of Georgia. I read Zhuangzi, and I was like, whoa. I wasn't even taking Chinese at the time, and I started taking it about a year and a half later, and that was all she wrote.
Yeah, it's in fact, before I get too deep into why we both like him, let me go ahead and just read the passage we're talking about, because it's not particularly long. And I should mention I'm getting this from Wing-Tsit Chan's A Source Book in Chinese Philosophy. If you have any interest in Chinese philosophy, this is a gold mine. Like, just the guy translated every single thing you read in this book and wrote commentary, which is unheard of. So check it out if you're interested. But this is, as Lee mentioned, one of the Weibian, one of the outer chapters. It's more of a story than any kind of quote-unquote philosophy we can talk about, whether there's even a meaningful distinction. So here we go.
Danger.
Oh, I should also mention most of these. Yeah, I know, right?
Genre questions.
Most of these don't. Genre questions. Oh man, talk about a nerd discussion. And I wish I didn't like it so much, but I sure do. I'm just such a dork. Anyway,
I've had these discussions with Professor Luke Haberstad at the UO, and he can talk for hours about genre.
Actually, a lot of our professors could. Mara Epstein had a genre question for her, and one of her email responses just said, "Oh, hearing genre questions from PhD students just warms the cockles of my old scholar's heart." It's like,
I love Epstein.
That doesn't surprise me. Okay, so enough sidetracking into our own personal nostalgia. So this one, the title given it by Wing-Tsit Chan is The Equality of Life and Death. So here it goes. Zhuangzi's wife died, and Huizi went to offer his condolence. He found Zhuangzi squatting on the ground and singing, beating on an earthen bowl. He said, "Someone has lived with you, raised children for you, and now she has aged and died. Is it not enough that you should not shed any tear? But now you sing and beat the bowl. Is this not too much?" "No," replied Zhuangzi. "When she died, how could I help being affected? But as I think the matter over, I realize that originally she had no life. And not only no life, she had no form. Not only no form, she had no material force, or qi. In the limbo of existence and non-existence, there was transformation, and the material force was evolved. The material force was transformed to be form. Form was transformed to become life, and now birth has transformed to become death. This is like the rotation of the four seasons, spring, summer, fall, and winter. Now she lies asleep in the great house, or the universe. For me to go about weeping and wailing would be to show my ignorance of destiny. Therefore, I desist." So much here that I like, and you could almost pick, it's a lot to unpack, you could almost find a random quote from the Zhuangzi, and it would be equally interesting to talk about. I should mention that what Zhuangzi is referring to in part, and I don't know how familiar people are with the chronology here, he's preceded, of course, by Laozi, who... Actually, I don't know, was Laozi supposed to be his teacher, or did Zhuangzi just kind of pick this stuff up from him? Do you remember?
I don't think that, so Lao Tzu, first off, probably didn't exist in real life. It's literally, the name Lao Tzu literally means old master. He's probably a collection of just various sayings that kind of have been picked up by village masters at one point or another. I don't think that Lao Tzu, in the story that is Chinese history / mythology, I don't think that Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi had a relationship, as far as I know.
As far as this, he has a great backstory. I don't know if you're familiar with this one, but there's an old folk story about the reason he's called Lao Tzu is because when he was born, he already had long white hair and white beard. So Lao, meaning old, master, Lao Tzu. It's great. No way that one's true, but it's a great story. So anyway, but Zhuangzi is referring in part to some of the philosophy in Lao Tzu, or the Lao Tzu. And there's a specific bit where Lao Tzu is talking about what the Tao is. And he's saying, we look at it and do not see it. Its name is the invisible. We listen to it and do not hear it. Its name is the inaudible. Infinite and boundless, it cannot be given any name. It reverts to nothingness. This is called shape without shape, form without object. That latter bit there, to form without object. If you're really wanting to hit the gas in your nerdmobile, you can bring up some Immanuel Kant at this point, because the great German philosopher had a lot to say about what's sort of behind the things that are supposed to exist. And so what Zhuangzi is kind of getting at least in part in his passage, and what Lao Tzu was getting at before him was, okay, so I'm here now. Great. What was before me? Cool. What was before that? How about before that? In fact, how far back can we go in this regression until we get a thing? And what they both come back to is it's just a constant cycle of form and transformation.
It's all, I mean, you're constantly transforming, and to believe that the ego, that is the you and the I, that we exist with independent of that transformation, is just an illusion. This is very much a kind of Buddhist thing. The Buddhists are really going to pick this up and kind of run with the ball in about a millennium after this. This strain of Chinese thinking is, I think, one of the most fascinating and one of the most intellectually challenging that you have coming out of the early Zhou period. By the way, we should mention, this strain of thinking is one of the most interesting strains of thinking you have coming from Zhou dynasty thinking, and we should mention that this is kind of coming before China unites as a single imperial state in 221 BCE. So this is probably a couple of centuries before that, during the latter part of the Zhou dynasty, and this is some fairly early stuff. I still struggle, Rob, with this passage because being attached to me, like, I can't think of the world without me, but that's something that, facing death, you have to reckon with. This world will exist without me here at some point, and it existed before that without me. I'm really worthless. I'm going to say that I'm worthless. I'm nothing to this world. I mean, if I can contribute a little bit, that's awesome, but it'll keep on kicking without me.
There's a verse in one of the Psalms in the Bible that says, every man at his best is a mere breath, which is a very sort of Zhuangzian, Laozian thing to say, except Zhuangzi and Laozi would say it, and David may have written it with kind of a smile, but Zhuangzi probably would have said it with a laugh or a smile. This is the thing, I think, that always draws me back to Zhuangzi. If you just think about these passages from the perspective of philosophy, here's what they say about life. Like you say, it can be kind of grim in a way. Like, really? I'm just random flow of particles, sort of everything that I am was here before I was, and it's going to be after me. Like, that doesn't mean I don't matter. And there's a point at which you can see Zhuangzi sort of transitioning out of this, right? So he writes, I was grieved that my wife died. Then I thought about the fact that everything that made her who she was there before her and transformed into her, and then she transformed. It's all just transformation anyway, as am I. Now, Zhuangzi's application, if you can even call it that, is basically to sing and dance.
There is a Chengyu in Chinese that's drawn from this passage, gu pen er ge. Baidu translates it as to face death with a positive attitude, to literally, what did you translate that as?
The earthen bowl is how Wing Tsit Chan translated it.
Okay, so beat the earthen basin, beat the basin, and sing. If we're gonna go all in on this, Rob, I'm gonna say, always look on the bright side of death.
I'm not. I was about to whistle, and I realized if I whistle into a microphone, it's gonna blow my system out. That's not gonna work. Yeah, exactly. People just like, did Skid Row just join him in the booth? What's happening?
But I mean, so you've got to be like Zhuangzi is advocating for being positive in death, and so those of y'all who are studying Chinese, pepper your speech with it.
Yep. If you're going to China, throw this one out there. You will blow people's minds.
Is anyone going to China? Is that possible?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's not one we want to take up right now. Zhuangzi would probably still find it funny, one way or the other.
There was a time when we could go to China. And now there is not a time this is not a time where we can go to China. This is the transformation of things. You just have to deal with it.
I saw a really hilarious, I think it was a tweet someone posted in one of the nerd forums, like it's not even like classical Chinese, but like classical Chinese from the 3rd dynasty, or whatever, the subgroup of the subgroup of the subgroup. And he had a whole thing about the transformation of things involving, I had a glass of chocolate milk. I put it in the freezer. It became ice cream. I took it out of the freezer and put it back on the table, and it turned back into chocolate milk. This is what is known as the transformation of all things. But we're sort of we're a little far afield here.
But that's exactly where Zhuangzi would want us to be.
Maybe it is. I should point out one thing. You mentioned that the Chongyu deals with a positive attitude in the face of death, but this is something even grimmer. This is positivity in the face of oblivion.
Yeah.
Which in some ways is much worse. The idea of death, I die, people are going to mourn and grieve for me, all the stuff that I was is gone. Oblivion is like it never mattered anyway. And they could be reading it a little too bleakly, but what I love about the way Zhuangzi deals with this, or the Zhuangzi deals with this, is that there are a lot of modern and postmodern philosophies that have a similar reading on reality. Like the thing you think is the problem, it's actually... I'm thinking specifically of Jacques Derrida. I don't know if you ever had the misfortune to have to study him in grad school.
Thank goodness no.
Yeah, I did. And anyway, but Derrida sort of delighted in pulling the rug out from everybody and going, you think this is what's going on, but there's traces of things that preceded it that actually make it what it is, etc. And it's just this thoroughgoing sort of relativity. There's always preceding something that precedes something, etc., etc. But you always got the impression that for Derrida and the people who read him and follow him, this was like deadly serious stuff. Whereas Zhuangzi grabs an earthen bowl and just laughs about it.
He's funny. He doesn't care.
He's very funny. And I have to bring this up. You and I, in fact, I should also mention we recorded this one before, but there was a technical error. And yeah, I know, right? Well, it's actually better. Most of these are better when we do it the second time because we know what we're talking about, kind of know what we're talking about. Anyway, but one of the things we talked about before was how both of us are huge fans of Kurt Vonnegut. I think sometimes he's my favorite American novelist. But for me, there's something eerily similar in the way both of these writers look at reality, because Vonnegut, too, looked at some pretty awful and grim stuff, and his solution, quote-unquote, for it was laughter, absurdity, alien stories, made-up religions. He threw all kinds of comedy at the problem, and I know Zhuangzi would have approved.
Yeah, the only way I keep from crying is by laughing. That's kind of the attitude I think you have to have when facing death, or it's the only one that generally works, and I think it's the one that most philosophers who are worth their salt, it's the position they end up taking. And I think that's why Zhuangzi is kind of the ultimate figure in Chinese literature, Chinese philosophy, Chinese thinking, that if there was one guy who I told you to read, one recommendation that I could give for the guy in Des Moines who knows very little about Chinese literature, doesn't really care, Zhuangzi's the guy I would have you read, because he's the philosopher. He's the beginning of a lot of the best thinking that Chinese thinkers have ever done. And it's something that figures like Vonnegut, like Kant, and others in the West are only sort of vaguely now starting to grapple with points that Zhuangzi had kind of settled.
Absolutely. And I wanted to point out one more thing that for me is so striking about this passage, and that not nearly enough philosophers in the West have figured out, is it's a philosophy of narrative. In the both in the traditional sense, where you're reading this, and what we're looking at in this passage today is literally an anecdote. It's a story. But the idea of constant transformation in general is narrative, right? You have this thing, which becomes a thing, which becomes a thing. This one thing after another, this cause and effect, that's the basic groundwork of any story. And so it's a whole philosophy that says what you're looking at around you is being narrated. It's happening. It's a series of events. So from one event to the next, things are just going to change. And you have to be cool with things changing all the time. And that was something that I disliked intensely about a lot of the philosophy that I studied in grad school. I mean, for as much as I think Immanuel Kant, I mentioned him earlier, is interesting, it's very brittle. It feels like, I will now explain all of reality and give you a perfect schematic for how everything works. And you're like, I'm pretty sure that's not quite how things
Zhuangzi would
work.
never do
It's
that,
messier
right?
than that. Zhuangzi is messier, and he allows things to be messy. And there's pathos, there's emotion all through this.
I think that pathos and that messiness is one of the things that I find so convincing about Zhuangzi, is because he reflects a more lived reality. He's not trying to be perfect. He's trying to just be right.
He's just beating earth and balls. Like, look, I figured all this stuff out, and you know what? There's not a lot I can do about it. And since there's not a lot I can do about it, why not go ahead and just sing? I just find that such a powerful sentiment, because it's in a lot of pop songs too, and that doesn't mean it's not quote unquote deep, but there's just so many collisions happening here that make me smile, and there's not a lot of philosophy that can make me smile.
And I think that's a great place to end it. Rob, we'll let our listener go off and sing their favorite Monty Python song, or maybe chant the benediction for the Baconist from Cat's Cradle by Kurt
Good
Vonnegut.
reference. Go read Cat's Cradle.
Whatever floats your boat or finds your lost remote, as some poets from Atlanta once said. Another great song.
I don't know if Zhuangzi would like this or not.
I think Zhuangzi would be a fan of Outkast.
If he ever even existed.
Which, that's but to be fair, does anyone ever exist? Would Zhuangzi even agree to that?
So we should have ended with me saying it makes me smile. Now people are like, oh man, now we're just going to be in the relativity graveyard.
And to bury this
Should we leave him in the relativity graveyard, or should we end with one more thing? Let's
bury this podcast in the relativity graveyard.
Just remember at the end of this to go grab you an earthen bowl, and it will make more sense.
And sing.
Yes.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.